And our last of the 6 keynote speakers, we have the honor and pleasure of receiving Dan Chodorkoff, who really doesn't need much of an introduction, because if you know your social ecology, you know that he's an anthropologist. I think we've had our quota of anthropologists. We're not having it anymore. Can you arrange that? Anyways, we've had our quota of anthropologists, and he's a very exceptional thinker and actor in the whole field of social ecology, having co-founded the Institute of Social Ecology with Murray Bookchin, and a working colleague of his for many, many, many decades. And we're so pleased to invite Dan here and to have Dan with us. Dan is also a member of the TRISE Advisory Council, so we keep an ongoing connection with him personally and with the ISC. And so I have the pleasure of introducing him to you, and having invited him to be a keynote speaker. I know the kind of sweeping global perspective that he's going to give us, which is a very fitting way to end our major speakers before we go into a very difficult but very important capital final roundtable called Towards an Ecological and Democratic Cities, How Do We Move Forward? So Dan, I'm sure, is going to help bridge what he has to say with that theme. And before I invite him to, I just want to inform you that according to Nathan, our leading statistician, who is live streaming our conference, there are over several hundred people who have already viewed the conference from outside. And we'll break down the statistics at the end of the conference and see who watched us and listened to us from where. Yeah.
Thank you, Dimitri, for your generous introduction. And before I begin, I'd also like to thank the organizers for inviting me here and for the wonderful job that they did putting this conference together for us. So, and I would like to thank all of you who are in attendance. I realize that it's been a long weekend full of ideas, and if you're like me, you're probably feeling a little weary at this point, and yet at the same time excited and energized by the discussions that we've had. I feel that I've been given an almost impossible task here following the incredible array of speakers and panels that we've already had. But I am going to try to offer some thoughts on how we might move forward from here. I think this is an important discussion. Once again, I'll be sounding themes that we've already raised this weekend. I think overall the connection between theory and practice is something that has been an essential part of social ecology, and certainly Bookchin's thought, though he was a scholar and did incredible research and produced very important works, he was at heart an activist. And for Bookchin, the real soul of social ecology was praxis, putting our ideas into practice, using our experience, putting them into practice to re-examine the ideas, and then taking those revised ideas and applying them again in the real world. And I think that's an overall framework that we should keep in mind. It's very easy, given the sense of urgency that I'm sure we all share, considering the time of crisis in which we're living, to perhaps think that it's time to act. And it is time to act, certainly. But that action that we take has to be informed, has to be thoughtful, has to be considered, and I believe should be offered within a framework of ideas that are developed and constantly examined and re-examined. So what I'm going to try to do today is lay out some broad ideas that I think can help us moving forward. I wish I could offer a prescription or a mathematical formula or a mantra that we could all chant that could get us to where we need to go, but I can't. As I said, I will try to offer some broad concepts and ideas. But I think each of us in our own particular community are going to have to determine how those ideas are applied in the world. Because the conditions in our communities differ, our cultural traditions, histories, the ecological areas in which we live, and the particular issues that we're facing vary. Certainly there's an urgency in Kurdistan that may not be felt in other parts of Europe or the US, though we're feeling some urgency at this point as well, obviously. I would also say that I think the crisis that we face, that we find ourselves in the midst of, really is unprecedented, certainly in my lifetime. I mean, the ecological crisis is evident to us all. It's transcended issues of local pollution or local development, and it's taken on really a global nature, which is something that certainly Bookchin was aware of in the 60s, but most people were not. Society as a whole chose to ignore, and segments of society are still choosing to ignore. And on top of that, we're now seeing a resurgence of fascism, which personally I find terrifying. And there's no question, to act, we may not in the future have an opportunity to act. So now is the time for action, but once again, let's make sure our action is informed by ideas. The first thing that I would offer is a quote from Murray Bookchin. Bookchin said that every revolutionary project is an educational project. And I think that's crucial. We need to educate ourselves. No matter who we are, no matter how widely we've read, there's an awful lot that we need to learn and think through. And I want to emphasize, too, that education happens on many different levels. I'm not simply talking about education in a classroom or education through conferences like this, as important as that kind of learning is, but that education also occurs through putting ideas in action. That education occurs when you learn how to act with others in a democratic fashion, when you begin to reshape your understanding relationship between you and others and the environment in which we live. Education occurs when you organize a cooperative. Education occurs when you organize a demonstration. Education occurs in many, many different ways. And we have to acknowledge that. We have to accept as well that different people will learn in different ways, that some people will be reached by an academic treatise. Some people will be reached by a polemic. Other people may be touched by a novel or a song or a work of art. And these all need to be incorporated into our educational process. So we really have to be holistic and multi-dimensional in the way that we approach this issue of education. And perhaps set aside some of the shibboleths that we bring with us, some of our preconceptions about what constitutes education. And we have a role to educate ourselves, and then very importantly, to educate others, to take these ideas out into the world, to not be shy about putting forth what we believe, and to be able to do so in a coherent and convincing fashion, in a way that will allow others entry into this new world that we're beginning to conceptualize and trying to actualize. I think this is really quite a critical moment, and that education process has to move forward. And I say this because what I envision to bring about the kinds of changes that I think we all agree are necessary is a process which is really analogous to the Enlightenment, a new Enlightenment, not necessarily in terms of the content, but in terms of the process. We have to remember that the Enlightenment began really with just a tiny handful of radical thinkers who were challenging all of the beliefs of their day, the idea that a king had divine rights, the idea that the masses were incapable of learning or incapable of governing themselves. Of course, this flies in the face of history and traditional cultures, but nonetheless, this was the paradigm in which the Enlightenment arose. And it took about 100 years for those ideas to begin to percolate into the population. Keep in mind, there were not levels of literacy like we have today, access to television or radio media. So these ideas were generated, and then they were passed hand to hand. People read pamphlets and discussed them over tables in taverns. And the process took 100 years. But these ideas did percolate, and they resulted ultimately in the democratic revolutions, which set the stage for modernity today. So it's an analogous process, except we don't have 100 years because our crisis is, in fact, so dire and so compelling that we need to act now and we need to act soon. But it won't take 100 years. Because in fact, these ideas, the ideas that we've been discussing this weekend, are already held by millions of people around the world. And it's important for us to keep that in mind, to not feel isolated, to not feel marginalized, because in fact, these ideas are at the center of the kind of change that has to occur if we're going to create a new world. So I would offer you that as a first thought, this notion that education, self-education and education of others is critical. And it's not going to take 100 years. We're already partway there. We have access to the internet, we have TV, we have radio, we have printing presses, we have relatively high levels of literacy, and we need to take advantage of all of that. We need to educate using all of these various media and means, and as I mentioned earlier, reconceptualize education as something which happens not only in formal settings like this, but also in informal settings through action. So that's the first thing that I want to emphasize, the need for education. Second thing that I want to emphasize is that I used the word revolution earlier, and I'm kind of surprised that I really haven't heard that word used much here this weekend. The kind of change that we're seeking really is revolutionary change. I'm not talking about the classic notion of revolutionary insurrection, going to the barricades with guns, though there may be settings in which that is necessary and appropriate to defend these ideas. But rather, I'm talking about a revolution which transforms the underlying structures of our society, the economic and political structures that govern our lives. And in order for us to achieve that, we need to develop not just revolutionary movements, but a revolutionary sensibility. The great Italian anarchist Enrico Malatesta said, everything depends on what people are capable of wanting. And I have to echo that and agree with him. If we can't develop the imagination to conceptualize a qualitatively different world, we're doomed. Because the world which exists is taking us down the path of destruction. I mentioned to Dimitri yesterday that Bookchin used to wear a button, and I realize I'm pulling out a lot of quotes at the moment, but it was a button which had a quote from Bakunin on it, and the quote was, "I will continue to be an impossible person as long as those who are possible remain possible." I think that's worth thinking about. We need this new sensibility. We need to reconceptualize our relationships with each other and our relationship with the natural world. And this is not a simple task. It's not simply an intellectual exercise. We need to incorporate this new understanding and this new sense of self and relationship to others into our very being. We need to transform ourselves. And it's a process, once again, which will occur through practice. In the crucible of thought and action, through praxis, we can begin to see at least the outlines of the new world that we want to create. And it's crucial. It's really crucial. I would suggest to you as well that this new sensibility really has to stem from a utopian framework. One of the great problems that I see facing movements today is the lack of a really, truly revolutionary imaginary. Certainly, we're facing pressing issues which require our attention. We see as we move through the world that there are concerns. I can speak from the experience in the US. Black Lives Matter. It's a very important movement, a crucial movement, because Black people are being killed by the police every day in the US. Civil rights are being denied to a whole segment of the population. They're subjugated to all kinds of degradation. And their struggle is crucial. It is necessary. But it is not sufficient to simply stop at Black Lives Matter for people in the Black community or in any other community. That struggle needs to be incorporated into a larger transformative struggle that recognizes, and I know that intersectionality is a very popular concept today. We use the term a holistic movement or a revolutionary movement. We didn't really talk about intersectionality back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Nonetheless, I think we can recognize that all of the various issues that people are dealing with be it Black Lives Matters or stopping pipelines or stopping the development of a gold mine here in Greece. All of these struggles really are one struggle. They're a struggle against a dominant culture which has no respect for human life, which puts profits before people consistently, and which is leading to the kind of rapacious treatment of the earth, which will ultimately lead to the decline of the human species and our ability to inhabit this planet. Bookchin saw this back in the 60s. He wrote about global warming in 1964, and he was ridiculed. You know, and at that point he said maybe in 200 years we'll begin to see the greenhouse effect take shape and influence our environments. He was ridiculed for that, and of course he was prescient in understanding that issue as he was in so many others. So we really need to be utopian. We need to be able to think beyond the given and understand that there are, within our current situation, potentialities that can be actualized that will take us to a qualitatively different place. And that's where we need to go. So when I use the word utopia, I mean it in the positive sense. I don't think I have to lecture the Greeks here about the roots of the word utopia, but it is worth mentioning that the word was coined in 1515 by Sir Thomas More, and that he indicated it had two roots, both from the ancient Greek, and I'll probably mispronounce them, so feel free to correct me. One was the word autopia, which meant no place, and the other was the word utopia, which meant the good place. And it is in that second sense that I use the term. Unfortunately, utopian thinking, has largely fallen by the wayside. We're told, oh, utopia, that's utopian. It's used as a dismissive or a pejorative. That's cloud cuckoo land. It's unachievable. It can never happen. Because in terms of the good place, we know, in fact, it is achievable. Because if we understand anthropology and we understand history, we know that, in fact, what is defined for us as a very narrow human nature, which is to be greedy and acquisitive and seems to undermine humanity and, by the way, fit beautifully as the rationale for capitalism. We know that previous cultures existed in very different ways with qualitatively different relationships with each other and with the natural world, which should in fact give us a great deal of hope. Not that we can return to these cultures, but rather that they represent certain principles which are part of our legacy as human beings. That rather, anthropologists, rather than talking about a narrowly defined human nature, in fact, use the concept of a continuum of human possibilities. And among those possibilities, and we know they exist because they've been actualized in other cultures, are the ability to function through mutual aid, to live and create an economic system that doesn't depend on the market, to make decisions in non-hierarchical ways, to live an egalitarian life, and to achieve a degree of self-reliance in our humanly scaled communities in which relationships are really based on face-to-face ties rather than bureaucratized, atomized, and alienated forms of social life. So that's the kind of utopia I'm talking about when I use the term. That reharmonization of people and nature and people and people. And I think it's very important that we begin to articulate our vision for utopia. And once again, there's no universal here. It's going to vary from community to community. It's going to grow out of our own cultures and experience. It's going to be located in a particular environment. But nonetheless, it does, I believe, if we are to succeed, have to be based on a set of broad principles on which we find agreement. And we've talked, we actually began the weekend talking about that notion, the idea of rights or a constitution or a set of ethical principles on which we can agree, on which we can find broad agreement. I would suggest even global agreement, ultimately. And then it will be actualized in different ways in different places. And this is how we find that elusive balance between the universal and the particular. That was one of the themes that we addressed on the first day of the conference. So. Now, where do we find those principles? Here, social ecology has some fairly concrete suggestions. Brian did a marvelous job describing Bookchin's concept of dialectical naturalism. And I think that dialectical naturalism gives us some insight into what those acting principles might be. And I want to lay them out briefly here. I mentioned the conference, and I want to expand a little on that at this point. I hope you bear with me. And I want to emphasize as well that these are tendencies in nature. These are not immutable natural laws, but these are possibilities which find expression at various times in various places. And they seem to inform the whole process of natural evolution. You know, we know the Darwinian model of evolution, which unfortunately has been misinterpreted and abused. We know the concept of natural law was one of the bases that the social Darwinists used to begin to grade people and cultures into different levels and very hierarchical schemas, so that they would talk about you know, the primitive and the civilized. And of course, it provided a marvelous rationale for colonialism and imperialism, because of course we're bringing civilization. The West was bringing civilization to all of these benighted savages, the primitives who could barely speak in the view of the West, who were barely human at all. Shun that notion of natural law. We also saw the abuse of natural law theory in Nazi Germany, and we know what the results of that were. But rather, we will talk about certain tendencies or principles in nature. And undeniably, competition plays a role. Undeniably, mutations occur through a process that sorts out winners and losers in terms of species, not really individuals. There are other aspects of natural evolution which have not been emphasized and in fact have been largely ignored. Among these, I think, are the fact that in nature and in natural systems and in natural history, there is no hierarchy. And I also have to add that Bookchin tried to elucidate these principles because he believed if we were to ever reharmonize humanity and nature, which is ultimately the goal of social ecology, a reharmonization of people and the natural world, a reintegration of first nature and second nature, which could then lead to a third nature. So if we are going to do that, we have to understand how these principles at work in natural evolution can be transformed and applied in human societies as well. First among those is the understanding that in nature there is no hierarchy. When we talk of the lion as king of beasts, the lowly ant, we're anthropomorphizing. We're taking our particular social structure and we're looking at the rest of nature and we're saying that's what it is. But it's not what it is. Ecologists know that. They understand that in fact there is not a food chain on which the big carnivores sit on top, but rather a food web in which interdependency is the role. The lowly ant, there are 40 or so species on the floor of the rainforest, plays a crucial role in decomposing the matter which then feeds the plants, which feed the herbivores, which feed the carnivores. And without the carnivores, the herbivores would destroy the plant matter. The carnivores help keep that population in check. And without the herbivores, the carnivores couldn't exist. And the lowly ant, of course, provides the nutrition that allows all of those relationships to begin to find their place. So nature is not hierarchical. And by extension, society should not be hierarchical. And once again, the anthropological record shows us that there have been, in fact, for the most of human history, people existed without formal hierarchies. And here I'm using hierarchy in the technical sense. A hierarchy is a system of command and control that ultimately has recourse to physical coercion. And hierarchical society is a fairly recent invention. For about 95%, to use the old anthropological saw of the whole of human history as a clock, it's only in the last 5 minutes or so of that clock that hierarchies emerge. We lived without hierarchy before that, which indicates that we have the capacity to live without hierarchy in the present. Sensibility and a question of the kinds of structures under which we choose to live, or under which we are forced to live. The second principle that I would suggest we need to derive from our understanding of the natural world, and which needs to inform our actions, our movements, and our utopian vision, is the fact that nature is mutualistic. Mutual aid plays a crucial role in natural evolution, and this was pointed out by Kropotkin and re-emphasized again by Bookchin and other thinkers along the way. Very important, mutualism, that this web of life is interdependent, just as we as individuals are interdependent, which is why humanity created societies. So that mutualism also has to be incorporated into our utopian vision and into the vision of the new society that we wish to create. Another principle is the notion of unity and diversity. When we look at natural history and ecosystems, we see that the most stable ecosystems, the systems which are able to maintain over time, are those systems that have the greatest number of species interacting at various trophic levels. That way, even though there may be great fluctuations in individual species, even the elimination or the extinction of a particular species, there are other species to fill that niche. And as a result, the ecosystem takes on kind of stability. It's not static, it's homeostatic. It's dynamic balance, but it's a balance nonetheless. And that balance is dependent on diversity. And unity is only achieved through diversity. And clearly, that is another principle that needs to inform our thinking and our action, our vision, and our movements. We need to strive for diversity and find within that diversity the strength that unity brings. Very important. Very important. Another principle that we can derive from our understanding of the natural world is the idea of homeostasis, which I mentioned earlier, that Bookchin understood as biologists understand that in fact nature is not static, nature is constantly changing. Natural history is a process of evolution. And in that process, we see a development. It's not a steady state of ascension. There are peaks and valleys, there's fluorescence and extinction. But over time, undeniably, the process of natural evolution has moved towards ever greater diversity, complexity, and degrees of freedom. And I say it's undeniable because if you think about it, all life on Earth began as single-celled organisms. And those organisms became more and more complex. They formed together to form various species. And as a result, we've seen, while there have certainly been extinctions and declines, overall, if you look at process, we've moved from single-celled organisms to highly complex mammalian life and a multitude of other life forms on the planet. And in that process, as well, as Brian pointed out, I thought very insightfully in his talk on yesterday, we have seen greater and greater degrees of consciousness and self-consciousness, the ability to make choices, and ultimately the ability to choose freedom. So once again, principles that we can extract from the natural world and apply in the specific situations in which we find ourselves to move towards ever greater degrees of freedom. The thing about freedom, though, and the thing about utopia, is that we will never achieve them. They'll always hover on the horizon, and as we approach them, they'll recede into the distance. But that's as it should be. That's because, in fact, nature itself, natural evolution, is dynamic, constantly changing, constantly moving, constantly developing. And we have to acknowledge that, learn to live with it, and embrace it, in fact. And we also have to learn to live with ambiguity. I was talking with Brian this morning, and for me, paradox, ambiguity, and ambivalence is inherent in the human condition. We need to accept that. Nonetheless, we need to embrace our freedom to make choices. So I'd suggest to you that these are some basic principles on which we need to find agreement, whether that takes the form of some kind of a constitution or a set of ethics upon which we can agree. There has to be a basis on which we can begin to create our free communities, because these communities can't exist in isolation. We live in a global world today. Globalization, of course, in its current form is an extremely destructive process, but there is the opportunity to create an alternative form of globalization. in which free, self-reliant communities can federate to offer each other mutual support and exchange, and to create a richer and fuller life for all of us. And I believe that has to be our goal. So, I've been talking for a while, and I have a little more to say, and I hope you'll bear with me.
Of course.
So this is all very abstract and theoretical, and I realize that. And personally, for me, discourse arises from the theoretical to the concrete. So I want to try to get a little more concrete now. I'm not going to be prescriptive. I'm not going to offer you easy answers or solutions, but I do want to suggest some arenas in which I think we need to begin to work and work effectively. The first would be to recognize the need for oppositional movements. Let's not fool ourselves. We're in the midst of a deep crisis, something unprecedented in human history, and I don't think it's overly dramatic to suggest that really the future of humanity on the planet is at stake today. And decisions that we make and actions that we take over the next 30 years are going to determine the course of human life on this planet. This is a big responsibility. And what we're seeing today, of course, is an increasing pace of exploitation and domination, a system which is rationalizing control of every aspect of our lives, which has expanded dramatically and not only now functions in the economic sphere, but has actually colonized our consciousness. So these are pressing problems. These are terrible, terrible crises that we're facing. And we need to oppose them. We need to protest. We need to stop the gold mine. We need to stop the pipelines. We need to stop the murder of Black people. We need to stop the imprisonment of British people. We need to do all of these things, and protest is a very powerful weapon in that process. Protest and opposition is absolutely necessary. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. It won't get us where we need to go, because protest is in fact about negation. We do need to stop those who are in power. We need to remain impossible as long as those who are possible remain possible. No question about that, but it's not enough. Not nearly enough. I think those of us who have been active have seen the limitations of protest. You know, we've been able to gain certain rights for certain groups. We've been able to stop wars occasionally. We've been able to prevent a dam from being built here or there. But basically, we're fighting a holding action. And while it's necessary to stop these exploitative moments from destroying things that we hold dear and that are an essential aspect of humanity and our relationship to nature, we need to move beyond protest as well. We need to move beyond opposition to reconstruction. So that's the second arena in which I would suggest we need to act. And once again, this is not something new. This is something ongoing, something that I'm sure many of you are actively engaged in. And by reconstruction, I refer back to the old wobbly slogan, the IWW, the International Workers of the World, and anarchist syndicalist movement at the turn of the 20th century, active in the United States. And they had a slogan that said, we have to build the new world in the shell of the old. I like that. I think that's a good formulation. And what that means is that we have to begin to create new relationships, new ways of being together, and we need to institutionalize them. This means creating cooperatives. This means creating community gardens. It means creating community housing. It means moving towards forms of mutual aid and cooperation, which this society tends to ignore or denigrate. And we need to put those forward as a way of showing people that, in fact, another world is possible, that we can build a new world in the shell of the old. And these experiences, these reconstructive projects, also serve as a form of education, because we learn how to come together and make decisions democratically, horizontally. We learn how to accept new and create new forms of leadership. When I talk about a non-hierarchical society, I'm not suggesting that there won't be people who are influential, experience, wisdom, knowledge, or brilliance, who can offer us insights and can help suggest ways in which we can move forward. But it will be a process in which leadership is redefined. It's no longer defined hierarchically. It's not power over, it's power with. Leaders in that sense. We need to educate ourselves and educate others and learn how to function in these horizontal and democratic ways. Very, very important. I think, too, this reconstructive process begins to show us ways that we can start to actualize our utopian vision. Personally, I had an incredible experience in the 1970s working in a Puerto Rican community in New York City, where people were living in a ghetto, 40% city-owned property, abandoned buildings and vacant lots, and through direct action, they began to take that neighborhood back and claim it as their own and reshape it according to a very concrete utopian vision, which developed through a series of community planning forums, where everyone in the neighborhood came together and they actually developed a blueprint for the neighborhood. This abandoned building will be the elder housing, this will be artist housing, this vacant lot will be a garden, this one will be a park. They went block by block, building by building, lot by lot, and they put together a plan, and then they began to implement it through direct action, initially as squatting in abandoned buildings and reclaiming vacant lots without any legal recourse, but through their own will and through the development of particular kinds of political pressure, through protest, through direct action, they were able actually to begin to transform their neighborhood. The Institute became involved with them because at that point we were doing a lot of work with alternative technology in the early 70s, solar energy and wind power, which we saw as crucial to the development of an ecological society, though of course we envisioned it's being applied in communities at a human scale, where people can democratically control them. Not the kind of corporatization of alternative technologies which has occurred today. But the point being that that kind of direct action is as important as the kind of direct action that we use in our oppositional movements. That we need to begin to actualize and create models for what society might look like. And within those physical changes that we make, we also begin to need to make the social changes so that these buildings were organized as low-income tenants, and the community guards are controlled by the people on the block. Whole actions that people can begin to take where they live today that can begin this transformative process. And we've heard a lot about that this weekend, and personally I find that very heartening. And I emphasize here that different people have different skills and different aptitudes, and that some people may be very effective at organizing street demonstrations, others may be more effective organizing a community garden. And the crisis is so dire and so compelling and is occurring on so many levels that there are many, many different ways that we can enter into this process of opposition and reconstruction. And finally, as once again, just a broad principle, I think we have to recognize that as important and necessary as these reconstructive actions are, they are not sufficient. It's very easy for co-ops to be incorporated into a capitalist system. It's very easy for our community gardens to fall prey to the bulldozers of developers. So we need to develop within our communities and ourselves this new sensibility that I referred to earlier as well. And we need always, I think, to be very conscious of the ambiguities inherent in human life. That our best intentions can be turned against us. So we need constantly to be aware of how powerful the forces arrayed against us are and how insidious they are, in the sense that we've internalized so many of the basic frameworks that capitalism presents to us, because we've all been enculturated in that system. So it's a question really of purging ourselves and then creating anew new ways of being, new ways of living together, new ways of organizing. And finally, because I am running out of time, and certainly we want to have a discussion, finally, the political realm, the realm of political action, is all important. And by this I mean really a redefinition of politics, not politics as statecraft, not politics of Washington or London, but rather politics on the most basic level, politics that are developed and applied where we live, right outside our doors, in our neighborhoods, in our towns, in our villages. And in order to do that, we need to create forums for directly democratic decision-making that can begin to create, and we need to institutionalize that. You know, I have a big problem with anarchism as it's developed in certainly the late 20th century on, because there's so much emphasis on individualism there. There's so much misunderstanding of the nature, the very nature of society. And there's a rejection of politics. Ultimately, anarchists say we want to do away with power. You know, and I'm sorry to tell you, folks, you can't do away with power. Power exists. The question is, how will we structure power? Are we going to accept power over, or are we going to create power with? And in order to exercise power with, we need to develop a form of politics. And this means we need to create neighborhood assemblies, town meetings, all kinds of forums, democratic confederalism. I mean, obviously the Rojava example is the most inspiring that I've seen in my lifetime. And it proves that it is possible. And my personal experience proves that it's possible. I come from the state of Vermont. We're a very small, very rural state. I live in a tiny town, 1,300 people. But my town for the past 200 years has been governed through a direct democracy, through a town meeting. We get together in our town as citizens, face to face. We discuss the issues that we face, and we make decisions as to how we're going to carry out our business over the next year. It works. And this is not a town made up of anarchists or hippies. This is a town that has certainly a progressive element, but also a very conservative element. And yet we're able to come together as neighbors, not as Democrats or Republicans, but as neighbors, and find a common interest. And in a respectful dialogue, we'll disagree. You know, we may even get angry at each other, but we walk into that room as neighbors, and we leave as neighbors. And in the process of making these decisions, we work through a whole series of issues. And you might say, okay, well, that's easy because it's a town of 1,300. It's tiny, it's humanly scaled, it's no problem. But I've had a similar experience working on the Lower East Side of New York City in the neighborhood of 30,000 people, where people form town meetings as well. And they came together in town meetings 4 times a year. And they went through this whole planning process that I just described. They created a vision for their neighborhood and their community. They began to contest with the official plans of the city and achieved a degree of success. So I've seen it happen in large urban settings as well. But it's not enough to just simply create these small-scale, face-to-face democratic forums. We need to use them as a vehicle to contest the state. We need to use them to redefine politics, to create situations in which there is true accountability, in which everyone has a voice in decisions that will affect them, a direct voice, not a mediated voice. And in order to do that, the flip side of this kind of decentralization, of course, is the idea of confederation. That we need then to create a confederation between our local democracies. Confederation, I would argue, has to be based on a set of common principles or ethics. Personally, I believe it's the ethics that social ecology puts forth. So that's the framework in which I think we need to move forward on these 3 interrelated areas, and alone, no single one of them, as necessary as it may be, is sufficient. It's only if we can holistically bring together these different levels of action and coordinate them and institutionalize them. Very important. It's another beef that I have with anarchism. Many anarchists are anti-institution. Well, I hate to tell you, but human society is based on institutions. And there are institutions. The question is, what is the quality of the institution? I've been very frustrated because I've seen many people embrace, I saw this in Occupy, for example, this notion of temporary autonomous zones, as if that's the best we can do. A temporary autonomous zone, a festival of the oppressed, as Marx called it. And these festivals may last weeks, they may last months, but ultimately they dissipate because we're unable to institutionalize them. I want a permanent autonomous zone, not a temporary autonomous zone. And I think that's really the direction in which we need to go. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, and we'll have some discussion now.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Pleasure.
Very inspiring talk. And he has been on the clock, 45 minutes. It was incredible, very precise. And it's very inspiring. All the time that I listen to you, I come back and I have so many ideas in my mind. So now we have a bit of time for a bit of discussion. So I will take 2 or 3 questions from the floor. And then we will have a bit of time to speak with him answering, and then I will take another round of answers, of questions. So,
and if you want to ask a question, but you don't want to be on the live stream, just say so.
Any idea? Any yeah.
It's a small one. It was like a great speech, or I liked it very much. It was very inspiring. Just a small thing. When you said about there's no hierarchy in the natural world, how do you the internal relations of each speech is mostly about how the different speech depend to each other.
Yeah.
But what the at least apparent relations of kind of hierarchy in each speech?
A very good question.
And to finish, I think even if, because in another point you said, as we see this in the natural world, we should do it as humans as well. But why should this be a relation? I mean, no matter what happens in the natural world, we'll have, I think it's really to decide about how to organize our own societies.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's the point, exactly. We can decide how to organize our own societies, and we must. And I'm suggesting that this model, that in fact, we had a whole discussion earlier and presented, I think, very lucidly, that, at least in Bookchin's concept, people are part of nature. There's first nature, which is non-human nature, and then there's second nature, and we are organic beings. We're an outgrowth of the process of natural evolution, and the same principles that have carried us forward through that process need to be and applied in human society if our goal is to achieve a reharmonization of first nature and second nature. And that really is the project of social ecology. In relation to hierarchies within species, keep in mind the technical definition that I offered. Hierarchy is an institutionalized relationship of command and control that ultimately has recourse to physical coercion. People often ask this question. They say, well, what about the alpha males in the guerrilla troops, Well, what you're seeing there is not a hierarchy. It's a form of situational dominance. And while in fact, ethologists who have observed guerrilla troops in the wild have noted that while the grayback, silverback gorilla alpha male is off beating his chest to scare off the other males and give him access for breeding purposes to the females in the troop, a younger male will be sneaking off into the woods with a female and procreating. So it's not even an effective form of situational dominance. So yes, I would maintain there truly is no hierarchy in a technical sense, certainly, in first nature.
Gemma from Edinburgh, thank you so much. That was really inspiring. Yeah, you're very memorable. Thank you. My question is, what does conscious leadership mean to you in politics?
Well, it's interesting. As I looked at anthropology to understand what qualitatively different forms of leadership look like. And, you know, when Western society encountered, say, Native Americans, they immediately looked for the chief, you know, and they couldn't find a chief. So often they would assume someone was a chief or appoint a chief. In fact, what happened in those societies was that leadership existed, but it was also situational. There was no penultimate leader. And the leader could not coerce others, could not force others to follow his or her will. The leader depended on their ability to persuade others through logic or through rhetoric. They were admired because of their experience, because of their knowledge, because of their insight, because of their proven ability to lead on a hunt and find the game that was necessary for the survival of the group. But once again, they couldn't force anyone to follow their instructions. They suggested or they exhorted, they tried to inspire. Maybe they manipulated sometimes. But they didn't have that coercive ability, which leadership in our society has. And true that in those cultures, leadership was situational, and at some point in life cycle, virtually every individual in a hunting and gathering band plays a leadership role in one activity or another. One individual may lead the hunt, another may lead the dance, another may lead in a healing ceremony, another may lead in gathering activities. Even the division of labor between men and women was very fluid. You know, we're told, well, men are the hunters and women are the gatherers, but the marshals who lived among the Khoisan people, the so-called Kung Bushmen for many years, observed that when women were out gathering, if they saw game, they would hunt it. And then when men were out hunting, if they saw something that could be gathered in the wild, they gathered it. So these hard and fast categories that have emerged in our time are really not an essential part of our humanity. There are alternative arrangements that have existed for millennia, you know, for most of people's time on the planet. We've lost sight of that. And I want to emphasize once again, I'm not a primitivist. I'm not suggesting that we want to go back to hunting and gathering, but I am suggesting that these relationships that existed in those societies represent certain principles, and they're principles that we can extract and dialectically transform and apply in our own society. And we have a lot to learn from these people in that sense.
Yeah. I found it great how you are putting up this, like, all different ways forward, what we need to work on. But I'm thinking of, like, your thoughts on this, like, when you see this in front of you, it's really like, oh shit, where do we stop? You know, like, because you need to work on all these things in the same time now.
Absolutely.
And, it's like, and how can you make that, where do we start? And that's what, to make a reflection on how, like, as well, thinking of what's happening in many places now. And I'm looking into the examples of the citizen platforms in Spain, and, like, in one way they're really great successes because they've been, like, coming from really popular movements and rising up, and, like, we need to like, how can we get power and distribute it to change the institutions to be more democratic. And they have got power in the places, but they are struggling with working within the institutions. But at the same time, like some people say, you cannot romanticize this because there's lots of, you can see failures in some ways as well. And it's like how you can see, like, some criticism is brought up that that the people that are in the citizen platforms are not, like, representing all people. There's more intellectual middle class. They are not in the periphery of the cities. They're real central, and there's not all the working class and race, etc. So they are failing on those things, and they are getting stuck in the institutional, you know, like, so, and they don't have the maybe they're working on changing the systems a lot, doing like assemblies, doing participatory budgeting, but at the same time they don't have as well, they haven't been building up popular assemblies and neighborhood assemblies in place, no? Like,
They are not so inclusive.
yeah, and they're not so inclusive. They've been talking about like how you're struggling with
Really divided in class.
divided in classes and
The
participate.
problematics.
Yeah. So like, if you have a comment on this of need to work on all this, but where do you start? What are the pitfalls? And you understand my?
I do. You know, clearly there's an urgency to our situation, and I think it's there's a very strong tendency to look to the existing means of power in order to ameliorate the immediate suffering and destruction which is going on today. And I think that has a certain value, but we have to. It has to be framed within a much more radical program. You know, Bookchin talked about beginning with your minimum demands, which might be something that would express through existing political channels. And then you move to transitional demands. You're constantly pushing. And from there, you move to your maximum demands. And in terms of where to begin, I can't tell you, Mal. It has to be, each of us has to determine where we can work most effectively and enter into this with whatever energy we can bring to it and whatever generosity of spirit we can bring. And we just need to keep pushing and keep working and recognize that it's not going to happen overnight. Though certainly there are moments when some of these ideas can come to the fore, but then we have to be ready to act to institutionalize them. We can't allow them to just become a tick. So it's really a question of where people feel they can contribute the most and where they can work most effectively, and that's where you begin, I think.
Okay, so we have two questions that them together. First here in the front and then here.
Dan, do you agree that in Europe we have to confront the big problem is, I mean, the nationalism and the tourism? Many people, the majority perhaps, don't want the refugees. They haven't any sense of solidarity.
Yeah.
It's about your opinion about the future of the social ecology in the societies.
Look, we're facing the same problems in the U.S. today. Thank you, Donald Trump. I mean, it's literally, we're seeing the rise of fascism. I don't know if people in Europe followed these events in Charlottesville last week or the week before, but what the media was not reporting was it wasn't just the fascists marching with torches. There were armed militias there. Right-wing militias that had automatic weapons, and they outgunned the police, which is why the police stood down. This is serious stuff. So, you know, I once again, I can't offer an answer, but we have to oppose it, and we have to oppose it on every level that we can. We have to confront them. We have to be oppositional. We have to shut down the fascists. I believe that can be done nonviolently. And we need to be ready then to put forward real solutions. And at the base of all of this, because we do see, I mean, were we to implement direct democracy in the US tomorrow, it would be a disaster. It would be a disaster because the consciousness is not there to support the kind of humanistic direct democracy that I think we all want to see. So education, once again, in various forms, is a key. We need to change consciousness. We need to develop a new sensibility. And we'll do that in different ways, working with different groups. I wish I had answers to these questions. I don't.
No, I haven't.
Theo?
Tell us, Dimitri, please.
Oh, wait, there is a question from Theo.
Yes. No problem for me. My question was partly answered because it overlapped. The thing is, we're talking about direct democracy, horizontal assembly, we're talking about how to self-organize both in a community of 1,300 people or in bigger communities. But sometimes when I read the writings of social ecology, they present some sort of harmonious society that function together from the get-go, and that would gather in an assembly and find common rules and come to common decisions as if they were all equal from the get-go. But is it not the case that we need first a process of equalization before we can all be equal? We can't just assume that people of a given region can gather in one place and suddenly be equal in front of the community. Someone might be, I don't know, a big landowner among these 1,300 people that gather in your village, who can control like the economic fortunes of the area, or a big property, a big business owner, or someone be a policeman appointed by the state, or someone might be a racist. Can we all assume that when we gather in the assembly, we're automatically equal? And if not, this power, you're talking about the power over and the power with, which has a resonance with the concept of Holle, with power over and power to. This power with, can it be conceived as a power of the whole of society with, or should it be conceived as a counter power, power against, to start with? So this power, would it be constituted on some kind of division, on some kind of special identity within society against some kind of identity? In the past, it was the working class, and then we found some various other substitutes, but do we need a special kind of we where this sort of counterpower is going to be based, or can we assume that just by gathering all together we're equal and we can form a power with?
Good question. And clearly those divisions exist. And as I said earlier, direct democracy implemented tomorrow in the US would be a disaster for the very reasons that you pointed out. However, my experience has been that when decisions are being made in a considered way by a community, some of those distinctions and identities begin to break down, and people do find common ground. I think we need to look for that common ground. At the same time, we have to recognize that there will be those who oppose it, and we need to create counter power. These are counter institutions. At the same time, as Malin said, we need to work to mitigate the worst excesses of what is. So it happens on many different levels simultaneously. I don't know how else to answer.
Yeah, Dimitri.
You know, I can feel the anguish behind some of the people who ask these questions. And the questioners are looking for answers. There are answers. There are answers for all the questions. And you know where they are hidden? They are hidden in history. We're not going to invent anything totally original here. So the beginning of answering your questions, all of them, without exception, is by educating ourselves, seriously educating ourselves. What Bookchin called affinity groups or study groups or book clubs. You have to review the existing literature, and you have to begin to grapple with the mistakes of the past and the achievements of the past. They're all there, believe me, the answers. And you cannot do that alone. That's another problem. The individualistic propensity to seek the answers, to pose the answers, and to seek the answers alone. You cannot do that. So, for example, we have created this institute here in Europe. It took us 2 years to organize this conference in Thessaloniki. It has been a tremendous educational experience for everybody here, without exception. But it is not enough. In other words, if we envisage a program in months and years to come, where this kind of educational experience takes place in any number of cities in Europe, then we are taking concrete steps forward.
concrete steps forward. And when you start looking for answers in history, you will come to one conclusion. Not institutionalize the politics that we believe in or we think we believe in without creating a power base within your city. A power base within your city that is based on a number of. And what is the nature of that power? The nature of that power is both political, it's economic, it's social, and it's cultural. And once you have a power base in your respective city, a solid one, based upon what you have discovered in history, what you have learned in the process, informed by social ecology, then you see the battle lines between yourselves and the institutional power that you want to dismantle. That is the strategy that has to be openly discussed, and I hope that in the concluding panel, we begin talking in that direction. You know, you asked the question, and Dan gave you an answer going back to other forms of society. Well, I'll give you another example of where that kind of answer could be found. If you look at the recent studies by archaeologists, there are archaeological studies of how the ancient Athenian citizens' assembly functioned. And the knowledge of how those assemblies functioned is not only largely unknown, especially by the Greeks, by the way, largely unknown, but is largely ignored. There you will see, if you have an objective study, make an objective study of what you will discover, the recent writings of what you will discover, you will see there a process of decision-making. Granted, it was amongst males, we know all that, but the basic process was profoundly, and it was revolutionary because it never existed before then. And it unfortunately never existed on that scale since. And so that is another model that we have to look at. We have to study it, we have to discuss it, we have to debate it, and we have to see how it can be implemented in our neighborhoods, in our cities. I mean, when we talk about the decentralization of power within a city, within a municipality, there are all sorts of possibilities in front of us. So the more concrete you become, the more you understand that you have to go further in your own self-education and bringing together your brothers and your sisters, forming study groups, forming book clubs, forming what Bookchin call affinity groups, and getting down to serious intellectual as well as emotional re-engineering of yourself. Okay? That's what I would propose as a large part of the answer that we're looking for.
Thank you, Dimitri. I would agree with you. Absolutely. I tried to emphasize that education has to be at the core of this process of change. And it begins with self-education, but then we clearly need to reach out to others as well.
Okay, so time is running over, so we'll take just one more question from Avin.
Or maybe a question and
or a comment, yeah.
Maybe in the next session anyway. But I just want to begin by saying with something that Öcalan says. He says, quite the contrary, 21st century is the century of hope. They would like us to believe that it's the end of everything, but it's the end of them. So therefore, there is an instantaneous moment of freedom here, which the Kurds have actually used in the form of Rojava. And while everybody expected the Kurds to be either the part of the Syrian regime or, you know, bow down to the Free Syrian Army, which was, you know, US and everybody was trying to build momentum for, Kurds said no, no to neither. They didn't even fight them. They said no to both of you. We'll just do what we're saying. That what we believe, how we want to live. So imagination, as I also brought up in my presentation the other day. So therefore, I think this is where the conquering begins. That they put in our hands, you know, the environment is going bad, you know, like we're looking for life in outer space. So forget it, let this world go, let everything go, don't organize, don't do this. You can't fight against the most powerful forces. I mean, you know, Turkey is the second biggest, has the second biggest NATO army in the world. So therefore, you know, they've been telling Kurds, like for the past 50 years, you can't deal with this army. What are you doing? You're getting yourselves killed, you know. And this is just to make sure that we do not leave our templates and we don't go on with something different, because we look for approval. This is what Kurds, what they didn't do in general, but also in Rojava. They didn't look for approval. They just took the moment, and they are doing it. And I will explain more how they are doing it next session.
So I want to close the session, and I want to thank you, Daphne, Dan, and for the introduction from Dimitri, and for all the participants. I think that we had a very alive discussion, and there is a lot more to discuss, and we will have the final panel that will try to wrap up a bit all the discussion that we had in this conference. So thank you again. Thank you.